Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming. My name is Hollow and today I'm finally talking about Baldurs Gate 3. There's a lot of people, including myself, finally paying attention to the game, learning about how it works, trying the early access for the first time, basically getting to grips with the massive amount of information within and surrounding the game. So going in, what are some important things to know before we get our hands on the game and you try it yourself to make things smoother for your first experience? We'll begin with what is probably the most important thing immediately, and that's interacting and examining things. Examining things could be like enemies and their enemy type. It could be objects and terrain. It could be in the character creator, learning what this effect or move actually does and what that means. Examining just tells you information about everything. Leads to a massive amount of detail that can be overwhelming if you saw it all at once, but that's the point of it. It just gives you a little bit of information about the specific thing you're actually examining. Learning what's going on, what will happen, what it actually means. Like take an undead enemy. They're ultra weak to some things and totally immune to others. Knowing that before you just blindly attack them and then you use something they're totally immune to would suck. For example, enemies can be vulnerable to a damage type, meaning they'll take double damage. It could be normal, so you roll normal damage. They could be resistant, so they take half the damage from that damage type. Or finally, like I just said, completely immune, meaning they'll take no damage at all. So as you are new and learning enemy types, for example, you should examine them and learn what you need to actually be using against them and act accordingly. In fact, examine can even tell you about objects in the environment, like I mentioned, what type of damage will be needed to break a door or a floor, things like that. I'd strongly recommend then using examine throughout, say even, your character creation process, so you learn what things will actually do, and then you can make more educated choices because of that. And while we just mentioned that, let's talk about damage types. Specifically, right, there's 3 types of physical damage to be aware of. There's bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. Basically, following on from the inspect concept, you could be facing skeletons, right? Go figure, they're not going to care that much if you're stabbing them. But if you were to hit them with a blunt attack, it would then be a lot more effective in this case. Being aware of that simple concept is obviously huge. So perhaps your character with a sword should find a different way to deal damage. In that case, obviously blunt would be great. There are different ways you could do that. You could use an offhand weapon, like maybe you're holding a torch. You could throw something from the environment at them. You could improvise a weapon and so on. But blindly attacking enemies without inspecting them or knowing your effective damage type will lead to much worse results. There's a lot more than just 3 physical damage types in this game, but learning about them step by step is probably the best way to go about it rather than overwhelming yourself. Speaking of throwing things, let's talk about common actions. Common actions are abilities everyone gets, whatever class they are. Some of these are simply incredible and very straightforward to use as well. So let's talk about the ones that I think are most useful immediately. The first and best one, I think, is going to be throw. All it really requires is that you're next to the thing you're going to throw, and I believe it uses 1 action point. You just need to have the strength to throw the item, so obviously the bigger the thing is that you're trying to throw, you will require more strength, and it might not go as far because of that. But it can be really effective. Say there's potions nearby. You could throw something poisonous at an enemy, and that would otherwise be totally impossible for your character to poison that enemy. In many environments, that could be something explosive, which could be really impactful on a fight. You should also be aware that some items, such as weapons, actually have perks, such as a thrown perk, so it'll deal the stated damage compared to very little with something not suited to throwing. And it makes logical sense when you stop and think about it. The next most important common action has got to be jump, which has you jump a distance determined by your strength. Now, the higher you are at the time of the jump, the further you'll go, but you want to be wary because there is indeed fall damage in this game. How it works is it takes 3 meters of your total turn movement, right? But then you can jump, say, 5 meters or much more if you've got higher strength or from a higher place, but it only really consumes that turn as if you've used 3 meters of distance. So using jump, you can actually cover much greater distances in 1 mid-combat turn. Using a bit of movement and a jump seems to be a very effective way to move around in combat then, especially when trying to move away or to a target. Plus you can use jumping to reach high ground, which has important perks we'll mention in a sec. The third most important common action then is probably hide. Being hidden in combat means you'll end up with an advantage on your attacks mid-combat, or if you start combat from being hidden or stealth, you'll surprise the enemy, which means they'll lose an entire turn initially, which will give you a major advantage in an opening of a fight. This is often best used in turn-based mode, which I'll explain in a moment, but that allows you to basically position while the enemies stay still until you finish your move. Now, there's a lot more than just 3 common actions, but they all depend on the situation and why you'd be using them. Sure, Shove is obvious, right? You could shove people off ledges, which might be a really high damage, fall damage related move to do, and it only costs like a bonus action. Just be aware that shoving things is based on your character versus the thing you're shoving, so a massive enemy is going to be hard to shove versus a small one. There's dip, which is hilarious. You can dip your weapon in different things, like fire. You could dip an arrow into fire for a fire arrow, create yourself a fire sword. That'll give you 3 turns of whatever effect you've granted yourself, modifying your damage to benefit. So it's worth checking your environment for things like that. Even something as small as a candle can work. Or the last one I'm going to mention before we move on finally, dash. Double your movement for an action point, which can really help you escape or reach targets. A good idea then to use dash before you end a turn, just for the extra benefits it might provide. Speaking of which, finally moving on from those, what about the fact that you have a total of movement or action points during combat? Try to remember to generally always use as many or all of the action points each turn. Most times you're gonna go up to an enemy and hit them, and you'll have a little bit of juice left over for, say, a common action or something, a buff, potion, whatever it is, something that might help your next turn. It could be as simple as moving your character out of line of sight before actually ending your turn, which can be a very effective yet really simple and obvious thing to do, meaning distant enemies can't actually range you because you're not in line of sight. So why not do it? Make the most of your action points. Okay, so I mentioned the use of turn-based mode in regards to hiding, so I'm just going to quickly explain that concept. Basically, you can activate a turn-based mode to change the way time is actually progressing. Normally, a patrolling enemy will just move around in a circle, right? But once you go into turn-based mode, they stop completely. You pause the movement of enemies until your action is complete, which allows for careful positioning of your party. That makes a lot of sense, like I said, in regards to stealth to avoid line of sight or dealing with trap environments. There's a button to use or a keybind, which is shift plus space on a keyboard, but just make yourself aware of that. Maybe you're playing on controller. The next point I want to talk about is damage versus side effects. Let's speak on your attacks, your abilities or spells or whatever you're using. Basically, when you're choosing from your options, you'll likely as a new player stick with what makes sense and is simple. What does the most damage? What is the bigger number? But I just want to quickly highlight an issue that I had in the early access because I thought like that originally. There's the secondary effects of these options, such as line of sight or distance preventing some actions being taken versus, say, a spell or action that doesn't require that same detail to be used. So you want to think beyond bigger number equals better in all cases and consider things like damage over time, does it require line of sight, and so on. Some actions even affect the environment. You can turn, say, liquids to ice. Technically, you might be dealing a few more damage points with one ability, but you might completely mitigate the opponent's next turn, which is obviously worth a lot more in that case. So just little things like that, consider it when you're reading abilities and why. To our next topic then, what about your party and party management? You want to consider who you're bringing on long term and why. And of course it makes sense to, rather than having a very single-minded party that has issues the moment you deal with something they're not strong against, it's better to have a balanced team for different purposes. Maybe you've got someone to scout the area, someone that plays at range, someone that goes up front, maybe you've got summons to distract enemies, so on and so on. There's loads of different ways to organize a party, but having a varied sort of option for different situations is always going to be good. But what I really want to highlight is the management of your party in combat situations. As you'd expect, you want ranged members to not be up close and be at range, so positioning them intentionally is a good idea. But beyond that, positioning them up high where they have like wide-reaching line of sight, and also they're in awkward terrain that means enemies have to clamber up to actually reach them, could be much better. By being higher in elevation versus the enemy, you can actually increase your hit chance and improve the damage of the attack. You get the perk known as high ground whenever you have that effect, so it's easy to know. Beyond that, you can also group or ungroup specific party members by clicking the button below their icons, literally called group and ungroup. This can be used for splitting your party into different little groups, meaning maybe you've got a couple ranged characters who you quickly move together to a high up spot, melee characters going together, things like that. These little details can make the moment-to-moment planning and execution of your choices obviously noticeably faster. This doesn't matter when you're new and learning in the beginning hours of the game, but after many hours, being efficient with your turns and actually making choices in better time will make a difference. Moving on from that, one detail from all the information we have online is to do with equipment. Equipment looks to be really strong in Baldurs Gate 3, with some crazy effects that will often change the way you approach combat with that character now they have the item. Something to be aware of from the information online then is apparently a majority of the builds affecting equipment isn't going to hit in Act 1, but maybe Act 2 and beyond, which to be honest makes sense. Probably trying to prevent overwhelming you, so you'd have to worry about having a perfect set of gear in Act 1. And that's not to say that we won't get interesting items that will change builds and, you equip to certain characters and it will matter, but it'll be a lot less than Act 2 and beyond, so you won't have to overly worry about it. Hopefully by the time you do hit Act 2 and beyond, you'll have a better grasp and experience with how items work in this game. But from what I've been told, you will get way more impactful drops. There will be vendors that provide a lot of options. It's going to become a much bigger part of the game and essentially forming a build. So on that note, builds. Builds are tied to a lot of things, like the race you pick, the perks that provides, the class abilities or the subclass, your equipment of course you're wearing, the fact that you can sort of mesh classes to multi-class. All of that is very overwhelming conceptually for a new player, but definitely don't worry about it. You'll be able to respec, meaning if you have a build in mind but things turned out differently, or maybe you have no idea what you're doing and you've just put points into things and now you realize you want to change, you can respec. The devs have said they want you to be able to really explore all the options you can without having to full remake and replay the game every time. We've been told that there's a character you're very likely to meet and certainly can go seek out to be able to reset your class and reinvest all your levels. So I encourage you to experiment and try things and do that without too much worry, because you know you can reset and clean things up when you actually know what you're doing. Progressing that point to our final point, let's talk about both multi-classing and feats as a heads up. Feats are a very important passive improvement to your characters. You gain them at levels 4, 8 and 12 in levels for a class specifically. Feats can be fantastic, things like the extra ability points to spend, defensive options, feats that encourage a specific playstyle and build, like, you get a perk when you're wielding a melee weapon in both hands. Feats are great, and you can pick any feat, whatever class or race you are. It's just a long list of options. But there's two ways I want to warn you. Firstly is that feats can require something, like you might need a certain amount of a stat, like strength at a minimum level, to actually use that feat. Which actually means, let's say you have exactly enough strength to use that feat, but then you're debuffed and it lowers your stat for a little bit, that will actually take the feat away from you. You won't be able to use it during that debuff. And second to that, in regards to multi-classing, is another important thing to know. I just said that you get feats at level 4, 8, and 12, but I said specifically at class levels. That means if you're multi-classing, you have to follow that multiples of 4 pattern. 8 points spent on one class and 4 on another, or vice versa. Your character level is separate from this entirely. Interestingly, some classes get important perks at other levels beyond the feat levels, right? So say you're level 5 or level 6 in that class, now you unlock a second attack per round. So details like that is what should influence which multi-class builds are actually viable and work well versus just being one class being a better option. Multi-classing is going to be complicated. You're going to have a plan and work these things out, but it can be done and it can be done well. But there you have it. 10, or well, to be honest, more than 10, really important details that should clear up a lot of the concerns and hopefully give you a lot of useful tools to approach the game with. Of course, there's way more I could talk about, but I think we're already touching on overwhelming levels of information when it comes to new players. So if you have any useful tips or other details that would fit here, then you can drop it in the comments. Maybe you'll help someone. For now though, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.